Can you hear me? Good morning, Serenity. How are you today? Good. Well, I hope that extra hour of sleep was not too tiring. I just got up a minute ago or a few days ago, but today I'm going to talk about Phuket, which is, of course, we're arriving this afternoon. And I'm sure most of you have been to Thailand, so much of it will be somewhat familiar, but though this is a special island on the west coast of Thailand. As a sailor, and I hold an active duty merchant marine officer's license from the U.S. Coast Guard, and I'm also a marine security officer. And I've worked on all kinds of ships all over the world, but especially around in Asia, particularly in China for many years. I ran a fleet on the Yangtze River, where instead of guns we had champagne in the modern way. And so I have been to a lot of these places many times, and I'm always surprised that there's always something I've never seen before. And I'm often looking out onto the water wherever I am, just watching to see what's out there, and particularly this kind of tropical calm you get to here in the equatorial latitudes is very relaxing on a ship like this. But I've worked on tall ships and ocean yachts and things like that. The one thing we fear most is no wind. And you can imagine 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, all of these trading vessels would be coming right up here through the Straits of Malacca, and they would be becalmed, and then they would be preyed upon by pirates. Now we don't have that worry aboard this ship, except, of course, online. And so I was looking out just the other day, and as I talk about these places, I'm always taking a picture to see where we are. Now this is the Andaman Sea, which is the body of water. Now Phuket is right at the bottom of the screen there, and then this is the Great Bay of going up into Rangoon and Myanmar. See the muddy effluent coming out, and this is a opening up to the larger Indian Ocean, but it also has a monsoon climate. There's rain to the north of us, and we may have some storms at sea as we cross over to Sri Lanka, but we're at the sort of shoulder season, so it's not really bad weather yet. But just looking out on our way out of Singapore, I was pleased to see that the local marine forces are out there, the Navy and the Coast Guards, to keep the pirates away. Because when I first came working on ships out of Singapore, we always had to have armed guards and barbed wire and escort ships and things like that. Much of that has been suppressed in recent time, but just the seascapes here are quite remarkable. I took this picture just on our way out of Singapore, and as you've noticed, the weather can be perfectly calm and clear, and then suddenly you get a knockout of a rain storm passing and a gale, and then it's all over. Well, that's the trick of the tropics. You think it's going to be easy, then suddenly it isn't. You know, the old saying about particularly sail ships, it was unrelenting periods of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. And then if you got to port safely, you wish you were home. Well, here's another little sight I saw out as we left Singapore, an island with some of the navigation beacons, and you saw that tremendous fleets of ships at anchor waiting for business and orders and things like that. So the Singapore is, as I said in my talk that was televised the other day, is one of the major shipping centers where ships go to rest because of the generally calm water. Because you go over to the China Sea and to the Western Pacific, it's often very stormy. You go out into the Indian Ocean, you get the monsoon winds and weather. But right at Singapore, it's actually one of the most calm major harbors in the world. And of course, it's always warm and not conflicted with winter weather, which we may remember from our homes. But I saw this, we passed by this little fishing boats were coming out of this little islets there. And then we all but ran into this fellow who was too busy pulling nets to even look up. And then probably one of them looked up and saw our ship, and they said, "It's a whale." And then the other one's, "Oh, you're just hallucinating. That couldn't be possibly there." And it reminds me of the old story of the fishermen are out pulling their nets, and sure enough, they pull up a lamp. And one of them rubs the lamp, and the genie comes out and said, "I'm tired of being pulled out of the sea. What do you want? I'll give you one wish." And so one of the fishermen immediately blurts out, "I wish the ocean was made of rice wine." And he said, "Okay, genie, there it is." And suddenly they're surrounded by wine. And the other fisherman hits the guy and said, "Now look what you've done. We're going to get all drunk. We may not find our way home, and we have to pee in the boat. That's an old one, by the way. Anyway, you're familiar with Thailand, which is this kind of uniquely shaped country that stretches from the upper highlands and the mountains in the north down into the main valley of the Chao Phraya River, and then down to the isthmus where we are. And many of you, I'm sure, have been to Bangkok and seen the kind of urban congestion and industrialization that has turned Thailand from a rural nation into an industrial tiger of Southeast Asia. But we are quite 800 kilometers from Bangkok, and in an area of Thailand that was sort of considered beyond the pale of the elegant palaces and the lords of the central country, and we're very much in sort of a borderland with Malaysia. And the major difference is that the ethnicity changes such that the largely Buddhist population is now mixed with Malay and Muslim communities. And right in Phuket and the surrounding areas, most people are Muslim just to the south. And this has been a point of problems for the Thai government because there have been Islamic insurgents trying to break off the bottom counties of Thailand to join Malaysia, which is a majority Muslim country. Then there are all these mountain people up in the edges. You see the Karen that's the orange colored strip on the map. That is shared with the Burmese side, and those are mountain people that are Christian. And so this is a country of certain ethnic variety and conflicts. And if you can see the map, there are little red dots. Those indicate large Chinese communities which have traditionally run many of the businesses, including in Phuket, especially the tin and rubber plantations that were built here. Now, when the Europeans first came over and discovered this part of the world, it was actually Portuguese who first described it, and then came the Dutch and the British and the French. And so this was a pretty exotic place, and also, of course, very far away. And the Thai people were traditionally very welcoming of foreigners as long as they, let's say, behaved themselves. And so even in Phuket, there were French emissaries that came to try to establish trade for tin. And the King Narai gave a delegation from France the rights to live in Phuket and to operate some tin mines. Now, this was all very small scale back then, and it's all been dug out long ago, but there was a brief period where Phuket was actually a French territory. And of course, the Thais were very, let's say, diplomatic in their own way to this day. They've never become a colony of any other country other than having the Japanese come barging through in World War II. But here's an example of a French court receiving Thai delegation back in Louis XV's time and establishing diplomatic relations such that Thailand has continued to be a beacon of its own independence, and they're very proud of that. It's also a monarchy, but what it's also done is open up to foreign visitors and technology and education, as illustrated here by the Jesuit presence in Bangkok, showing the locals of modern astronomy. And so there's been a strong emphasis on scientific education in Thailand, including especially the nobility and the royal family. Now, this Chakri dynasty was founded by the King Chulalongkorn, whose name is all over Bangkok, the university and such. And that family continues on. It was followed by a number of other kings and queens, but Rama V here was the one who has been portrayed in The King and I. And of course, the Thais objected to some of the portrayal, and to this day, you're not allowed to see the Yul Brynner version of that. It's considered an affront to the royalty here. And the current, just deceased king of Bhumipol was very revered by the Thai people. And I remember a Thai friend who kept talking about my king, and my king is a personal friend, even though he'd only seen him from afar. And there's a great deal of affection, particularly for Bhumipol, because he was an agronomist with many patents to his name. He spent much of his time trying to improve the agriculture in the country. He was also a jazz saxophonist who played in Carnegie Hall once, and then he had a long reign of over 70 years, along with Queen Sikrit, who now they both passed away. And you may have seen on TV they had elaborate parades of the great royal barges in the Chao Phraya River in Bangkok. And then the son, the crown prince, Vajiralongkorn, assumed the throne, even though there was a lot of complaint that he was neither a scientist, a musician, nor even a very nice fellow, supposedly having been, let's say, a playboy all through his younger life. And now he is king and giving all due honor here in Thailand. I took this picture just January, where his official portrait has him looking like a deer in the headlight, because the royalty of Thailand is always on the defensive. Now, they are a pretty stable dynasty at this point, but they have a very unstable government, and the military coups have come and gone. All these prime ministers and elections have been tossed up and thrown out, and certain leaders taken into exile, like Thaksin, the former prime minister. And so there's a law, though, in Thailand. You may have heard of the lèse majesté, the French term for you never insult the royalty. And to this day, if you put on a post on Facebook or somewhere that I think the king was not dressed properly, the police will come and arrest you. And famously, they kick foreigners out for even making commentary that other people overhear. So it's let's say, a royalist monarchy with a military dictatorship and a police state. But that doesn't interfere with, let's say, the entertainment business and the tourism, which is one of the great industries of Thailand. Now, we're going to go down, of course, down to the tip of the Kra Peninsula here, where Phuket is an island, somewhat larger than Singapore, but with about 500,000 people registered on it. But they get 2 to 3 million tourists a year. And this is because of the beauty of this part of the sea and the resorts that have been built there. You can see that the Malaysian border is just south of here. So we were at Port Klang. Sometimes we stop at Langkawi or Penang, which is a much more developed island off Malaysia. And then we come up into the Gulf of Krabi, which is where Phuket is. And now this is an island with a big bridge over it, so it now is well connected to the mainland. But it was sort of a place to itself where it had its own defenses against invaders and people in the inland. Now, this whole part of Thailand was originally populated what they call the Orang Asli, which is the Aboriginal people, the original people, it means in Malay. And so there was always fighting between the Thais that would come to Phuket from the Central Valleys, then down here, and they considered this area very wild. And then it was settled, and tin mines grew, and there was foreign contact, and then Phuket developed as a resort center because it has such a beautiful string of beaches all along the Indian Ocean western side of the island. Patong and the other Katanoi and Karen beaches. There are dozens of them all over the place, some of which are highly developed and some that are kept natural and are pristine. And then on the bay side, it's sort of rocky where most of the people live. Phuket town itself is right there. Now we'll be tendering in, and you can go to the various outlets and to the small city of Phuket itself, but it is a sort of a typical Thai traffic jam with crazy motorcycles and trucks and a lot of, let's say, activity. And then you go out into the remoter areas and you have beautiful, elegant resorts, and then you have natural preserves, and there's a lot to see and do if you stay in Phuket. This is where we'll be landing. Unfortunately, they don't have a dock big enough for us, so we will be tendering into where there's a marina and other local ferry boats that come from various parts of the bay and go out from there. The town itself is fairly tidy, but it has preserved what they call the Sino-Portuguese style of architecture, which is somewhat like Macau and other places where the Portuguese went and left an architectural heritage, and then a lot of the shop houses like I talked about in Singapore. And then there's stalls of food. These are the local spring rolls, which you can get whatever you like in it, vegetables or shrimp or other seafood. It's called a phong, and that's a local delicacy. But a lot of our time there will be driving around to go to different activities, and there are all these roundabouts everywhere. We usually have a royal figure or a local figure as memorialized in this area. This is the city symbol for Phuket, which features these two sisters who are immortalized in their own monument right on one of the traffic areas. And they were defenders of Phuket from an invasion of the Burmese in 1785. And a lot of the men had been killed, including the commander, in battles trying to keep the Burmese from coming over onto the island. So they're called Chan and Suk is their let's say their common nickname. But they organized the women to dress as men and then make it look like they had many more soldiers than they did. And then they got into battles on the bastions and the bridges and things like this. And then they'd repulse the Burmese, including when they couldn't get their elephants. This was warfare with the elephants sort of being the tanks of the time. But they repulsed that, and then they became the local heroes to remind people of the battles of the past. This is their formal name, Tao Tep Kastriti Tao Sri Sunton. Thai as a language is extremely difficult because it has many, many tones and many expressions, and very few people actually master it unless you live here for quite a while. But anyway, these two warrior women are the symbol of Phuket. And nowadays, there's a different struggle going on, and I'll just show you another picture I took here a while ago of women warriors out there at night battling the forces of pleasure, I'd say. And this is a feature of Thailand, and I was amused by the comedian Stevens' comment about how nice Thailand is, because so many young women like to take gentlemen who could be their grandfathers around just to show them the town. Well, in the culture of Thailand, it's called the young women from the countryside come to study in the towns, and so this is a serious problem in Thailand with diseases and things, and then they've tried to crack down on the worst aspects of it, particularly child trade and things like that. But it's still a feature of sort of the melding of the cultures here, and you'll see it. And so Thailand has sort of taken in a lot of different outside influences, including, I saw this just recently, where even Ronald McDonald has become a Buddhist, welcoming you into the house of Scottish cuisine, or whatever they build it as around here. But Phuket itself is sort of developed into such a big resort area, but it's not a massive city like Bangkok or Pattaya and other places that are more overwhelmed, I would say. And it has these wonderful Buddhist temples. Now, these were mostly built recently after the fortunes of the tin trade, and then the rubber plantations came in. And so there was suddenly enough wealth to invest into the Buddhist temples. And so this is one of the things you see if you've never been into a Thai Buddhist temple before. It is a sight to be incredible with its distinctive architecture, and then its own style of Buddhism. Now, this is a Theravedic Buddhism with what this Buddha has behind him is the wheel. That's the wheel of Dharma, which is the inevitable turning of change in the world. And then there's a Nagata, kind of a serpent that floats and flies behind it as a protector of the faith. And you'll see all the symbology. But every time you go to a Buddhist temple in Thailand and you try to get a specific explanation of what this means and such, you'll always get a different answer, because it's such an elaborate combination of philosophy and mythology that it takes a lifetime to even appreciate it, I'd say. And in Thailand, the majority are Buddhist, and it is the duty of every young boy to spend at least 9 months between schooling as a young monk, shave their head, wear the robes, learn how to be aesthetic and not think of yourself and your desires, but to learn the tenets of Buddhism. And then you could continue on to be a monk further, or go back into civilian life and have a regular job. Curiously, when there's a coup d'etat and a political strife, the losing leaders are not sent to jail. They're sent to become a monk at a monastery for a period of time. So this is perhaps a political technique that could be emulated elsewhere. But of course, to be a Buddhist monk on the beach with all these tourists is perhaps a real temptation to let's say, consider the more earthly pleasures in life. But you'll see all through Thailand there's an incredible sense of devotion and delicacy and the kind of personal spiritual life that is represented in every house, and every business has what they call a spirit house, which is a small shrine where prayers and offerings are made every day with fresh flowers and things like this. And I think there's no other place other than maybe Bali that has as elaborate and beautiful religious tradition that infuses the population. So just the temples that we can go see here all of tomorrow, the Wat Phra Trong, a lot of them are very sturdily built with masonry and tile roofs. Now the traditional housing was all thatch and palm and very transitory, let's say, but the community would put a great deal of effort into building these quite elaborate and beautiful temples and gild the Buddhas and ornament the walls and the roofs with glass and ceramics. And so if you haven't seen one, I would definitely recommend go in, because you get a real sense of the aspirations of the community and the Buddhist people. Just to, like a great cathedral, they have spires and a great iconography of this kind of architecture. And those flying wings are, they're called thrang, which represent the spirits going off into the other realms of existence. They have these beautiful spires and multiple roofs. Some have said those are actually structurally very important, because if there's ever either a typhoon or other tempest around here, those roofs tend to deflect the pressure, and so they will not have that roof blown off, as will all of the common people's simpler roofs. Also, the masonry is often left on a stone or foundation but not connected, so if there's an earthquake, the ground can move but the temple remains. And all through Asia you have that tradition, such that some of these temples go back 1,000 years and they've had all kinds of natural disasters, but they survive. And of course, inside then you have your elaboration of the Buddha in many forms, and many of the arhats, or the scholars of wisdom, and the mythological characters, aspara, which are sort of heavenly angels that fly around and give blessings to people. And you can go in, it's open all the time. There are occasional ceremonies, particularly for Buddha's birthday or for memorial services for the deceased. But you have to usually have to take off your shoes, and you have to have a normal decorum in a house of worship. And so sometimes you'll see at the temple, they'll have these lists of things you cannot do. First, you need a ticket. Oh, well. And then the one I like here, you dress up, you do not climb, but do not dangle any doll. I'm not sure what led to that prohibition, but they've had a problem with some of the holiday seekers coming in and being, let's say, too dollish and inappropriately dressed. I don't think anybody here is going to offend the local sensibilities, especially in Phuket. But if you do, then they're going to send the Garuda after you. And there's a lot of demonology and mythology here in Thailand, and it also extends through Indonesia. This is my favorite, the Nagara, which is the flying snake that breathes fire to those who deserve it, I guess. So you'll see this as an example of the mythology that permeates Thailand. And it has many forms. We're going to Burma, which has a sort of even more fantastic temples in its own way, somewhat different, but we'll get a lot of this as we go along. So just even driving around Phuket, almost every other block there's another shrine or another temple, often mixed in with car lots and petrol stations and whatever you want. And there's the Buddha wondering, who put these electrical lines over me? And he can't get a good night's nap anymore. But over Phuket, recently built, is a 45-meter high Buddha that is clad in white Burmese marble. And this is a new thing we can go see there. And express peace and prosperity over what is somewhat of a turbulent tourist season, let's say. But even the great Buddha did not prevent the disaster in December 2004, when the earthquake off of Sumatra created the tsunami that came in and emptied the beaches of water like this. The nature of the tsunami, which in Japanese actually means the harbor wave, literally in the characters. But the water would go out, and then people would often go out and start picking shells and things like that. But in this case, they realized this is really big, because they had felt the tremors and all. It was a day later that the tsunami really came in full force. You've probably seen the films on it, but I don't show any films for fear of scaring people. Here's just the look of it coming in off the beach. And just at Patong, on the shore of Phuket, the wave was 10 meters high. And so that's did incredible amount of damage. They still don't know quite how many people died, in the thousands, and in the offshore areas. And of course, curiously, boats at sea would just ride over. It's when you're on the shore that it's dangerous. And this is what it looked like right downtown Phuket and Patong, where you can see that all the ground level has been completely washed out. But nowadays it's all been fixed up and it's back in business. There was even greater damage done just in the other parts. This is actually Aceh and Sumatra, where they lost, they just don't know how many, tens of thousands of people. The full toll was never really known, but just an estimate, including damaged parts of Sri Lanka and India, and the waves are actually felt all the way around the world. But meanwhile, it's all back to normal until the next disaster. Now they have tsunami warning buoys off of Thailand that are part of the International Tsunami Warning Network, which are a satellite network to see when a wave develops, so that people at least get warning, if not prevent the tsunami, of course. But Phuket has all these beautiful beaches, Katanoi and such, and they're often filled at the winter holiday in the north with lots and lots of people. So this has become the major industry for the whole Phuket area. Again, there are isolated places you can just leave the resorts and the traffic jam, and you can go find your own personal beach. The ones on the eastern shore are more rocky, and there's not as much surf, but they're often the ones that are empty. So this is just the attraction that so many people come to enjoy in Phuket. It used to be part of the population where they call the sea gypsies, or the Chalai, and it meant they were people that spoke their own language, and for how many hundreds or more years they were only living on their vessels, and they would go around and they would fish and they would live on boats. Now they have built houses on stilts. If you go on the Phalang Bay excursion, you'll probably go to one of the sea gypsy villages where they've tried to settle them in town. They don't want to live on shore, though. They consider that bad luck. So they have new villages where they have schools and clinics and things like that for the sea gypsies. But you'll still see their typical boats all over the beaches, and there's local fishing and transport. And of course now they take tourists out to go scuba diving and fishing and exploring this area. This is pretty vast, because you get just outside of Phuket, then you have sort of an endless variety of islands and beaches to go to. This is Tu Rua Tau Park, which is just south of Phuket on the bay, and this has been made one of the national parks for Thailand. But it has a curious history, because it had so many little islands and bays that it was, again, the sea gypsies lived there, and many of whom practiced piracy. So the various ships coming down the Straits of Malacca would be preyed upon by the pirates hiding out in these little islands. And famously, a group of British soldiers with their Malay colleagues were cut off when the Japanese suddenly came down from the north and then went all the way to Singapore. And they took refuge in some of these islands, and then throughout World War II they lived off of being pirates, and led by these British officers who didn't want to surrender to the Japanese, but then they had no provisions. So they ended up leading pirate raids out on other local shipping. And then when World War II ended, the Royal Marines went in and cleared them all out. But it's probably going to make a good movie somewhere if you can put a hook into it. But this is part of the, let's say, protection of the environment in this area, which has been suffered some from mining, from palm oil, plantations that deforest the jungle, to runoff from the resorts. And so even in Thailand, it's a debate, how much of this tourism business can we permit into other areas that are still pristine. So this is now a national park where there is no development, but you can go out there and go camping and such. And then the waters are full of beautiful fish, and there's a lot of scuba diving on the western shore. The bay areas are often kind of turbid and not good for seeing things, but this is an example of where people come here just to go off to offshore islands to go look at these unique butterfly fish, parrotfish, lots of species. It's one of the marine park aquatic reserves that draw divers from around the world, including the dugong, the sea cow, lives in the inner bay and grazes in the shallow waters. And then further out, there's still whales and billfish and things. The bigger ocean has still some good population, though it is being constantly assaulted by the fishing fleets, especially from China, have now come into the Indian Ocean, and they'll just take up everything illegally, and you can see all about it on TV. But it's an assault on the ocean, which is going on all over the world. But they're again trying to make marine preserves and patrol the coast so that the locals can have the local fishing without it being ruined by the outside international fleets. Well, this is an island where I first visited, 30 years ago. Koh Phi Phi, it's called, which is southeast of Phuket town itself. You take a ferry boat to get out there. When I went there, there was no electricity, but it was considered the most beautiful island in the whole area. If you can see it, there's a double beach. There's a beach on one side and a beach on the other side. So when you land there, you can go either way, and you have this beautiful, shallow, shelving beach. And it was just camping only or in thatched huts when I was first there. It then became a feature in a film called The Beach, shot there in the year 2000, which then led to a sort of a stampede of backpackers and then hotel development, and many more people have come there. But it's still a beautiful place in a marine reserve with these clear waters, and then the local people run boats off to the different points of island. There's a lot of caves in this area. So one of them is famous for being the source of the best, the bird swallow's nest, which is a delicacy for Chinese cuisine. And these are birds that make a spittle nest up in the top of the cave, and the local fellows will climb up scaffolding to harvest the nest, and then the bird will build another one. Again, they try to limit it so that it will not destroy the environment for the birds. But that's one of the products of these sea mounts, I could call them. And it's just very beautiful and sunny and clear and usually calm. You get around on these, what they call the long-tail boats. Now you notice this traditional wooden craft has this great extended propeller, and if you can see it, that's a automobile engine that is mounted and levered with this thing. And so the tiller to drive this boat is actually moving the whole engine around. It is a blisteringly loud way to get around. You may have seen them in Bangkok, these big roaring engines that are driving these boats around. It must have been nice back when they had to row all the way. Well, things are not going to be that way unless we go backwards in time. But this is now Koh Phi Phi right now, which has been rebuilt with new hotels and electrical generators, and they've tried to clean up they had a tremendous amount of debris, of course, and then now the party crowd is back. And I know there's an excursion there, but they're carefully not letting us stay overnight because it's sort of a wild place, supposedly, or for those same old things, whatever they are. But of course, the party was ruined in 2004. The entire island was washed over by approximately a 20 foot or 12 meter wave, and everything was gone other than the few concrete buildings. And they estimate about 2,000 people were swept into the sea right there. But now it's back. The other excursion that you could sign up to go is at Phang Nga Bay, which is, again, one of the more unusual seascapes in the world. This is a karst formation all through here of limestone, which is an old seabed that has been eroded down, leaving the harder rock. And it's not unlike where you can see it in Halong Bay in Vietnam or Guilin in China. But it creates a very fantastic and mythological landscape. It's a separate county to the north and the east of Phuket itself, which is its own county. And this is the symbol of Phang Nga Bay, where they have as a main business now taking the likes of us to go out and see this fantastic territory. So it itself has become not so backward and not so isolated. This is the city hall for the little town where you get on your excursion boat and go out into the bay, which has all of these mountains that pop up out of the sea and then create a seascape that is very extensive. And though the excursion can only go through a part of it, but there's many places that are in this, what's now again a national park, that are quite isolated and quite, let's say, mythological, with caves in these mountains. Again, the the rock would be eroded inside, outside, above and below to create fantastic shapes. In some of the caves, this one I found this picture, which is a fertility worship cave, in case you care for that. And but usually people just go out and they will go out and just cruise around on an old junk to go see particularly this collection of mountains, which is called Tapu, and other names for every island has its own name in Thai, usually a mythical figure or an animalistic figure. This particular rock was featured in the James Bond film of The Man with the Golden Gun, 1974. And so today it's probably the iconic structure of this whole area that people will go and take pictures. Of course, you can't land on it. It's sort of a turned upside down bottle in the middle of the ocean there, the calm waters of the bay. And so this is the fantastic seascape that we can get to visit here, however briefly. Now, a couple of years ago, I went out on a kind of a, let's say, not such a clear day, and so then it became even more mysterious because you didn't really know where you were going in the mists, and the rocks would sort of arise out, and we take a turn and go around somewhere else. And fortunately, the locals know exactly where they're going, but they may not tell us. And so we were taken to a certain place where we could land in the shallow, and then we could go in our own little kayaks to go poking around these islands, which have stalactites coming off the rocks and vegetation, and then they come under the undercut, so you can go in there, and often there are birds and bats and things like that that are living in these caves. But this is a sort of adventure travel for this particular area. I don't know if we'll actually have this offered with a kayaking, but the time I came here, we went into the mountain and through the caves, and sort of the birds singing and the water dripping and the wind blowing through. It's sort of scary because I wouldn't go in there unless I had somebody who knew how to get me out of there. And so we went into, if you've ever been caving, it's not for claustrophobics, that's for sure. And so here we are through a sea tunnel going into the mountain, and it's very spooky. Now, of course, that's only for those who really want to have this kind of adventure, but I'd never had this experience where I actually paddled into a mountain and then had a kind of a sea lake in the middle with waterfalls coming off of the center of the mountain. So they're very hollow, some of these are riddled with caves. And so, this is sort of where you start to see things, and the trees and the rocks and the sounds sort of begin to call to you. And we came to this point where there was a whole mangrove forest in the lake in the middle of the mountain, where I took a picture and I saw this. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but this is what I remember. And all I can say, this reminds me of the old saying, what does a mermaid really want? A merman. Well, she'll settle for this guy because he can play the flute. Well, anyway, I leave you just with you can come here in this fantastic landscape or this interesting culture where you can find your own myth and make up your own legend if you want. And even if it's getting developed with bridges and hotels and now direct air flights from Bangkok, it still has a kind of a magical quality to it. And the people are very welcoming and courteous to us all. You don't feel that they're overwhelmed, even though they have maybe more visitors than they could ever have imagined in the old days. And so Phuket and this whole area is one of the reasons why you travel and you see things, even if you've been there before, that you'll never forget. With that, I wish you a great visit in Phuket, and I'll see you around the ship. Thank you very much.